Welcome, Dr. Epic here, and in this lecture we're going to go to an undiscovered country, a place of science, pseudoscience, and critical thinking, featuring biblical giants, slashing razors, the last stand of an American army, and the secret of Bigfoot. We're going to follow that outline right up above my head and explore the forbidden archaeologies of the fantastic human past and what they don't want you to know. We're going to explore the science of archaeology. Now, what is archaeology? That is archaeology. The definition is right over there. Archaeology is the scientific methodology that explores the human past through the medium of the archaeological record. And it's handled different ways in different places. In the Americas, in North and South America, archaeology is generally part of anthropology, part of the social science of anthropology, or ethnologia when you get south of the Rio Grande. But in the old world, in Europe and Africa and Asia, generally archaeology is part of history. But the distinction is not really that important anymore. It was really important in, say, 1950, but by the 21st century, it's not really important. Because you see, archaeology is primarily a methodology. It's a way to create knowledge about the human past through the study of the archaeological record. So what is the archaeological record? Well, that's the archaeological record, or at least part of it. The archaeological record is different from the historical record, which is the written documentations of the human past. The archaeological record consists of the remains of humanity's extant material culture and its resultant impact on the environment. The archaeological record consists of artifacts, ecofacts, architecture, features, and any significant material trace of human presence on a natural or a man-made landscape. And I'll give you an example. That structure right up there, that is El Peruaca, structure M1415. It is the ruins of a residence, a Native American Maya residence, turned into an ancestor shrine over the course of its usage. And again, when I excavated that structure, I'm not interested in the history of the structure. I'm not interested in the archaeological record itself. But what I wanted to do is use the data from the structure and the artifacts and the ecofacts and the features and the burials and the bones and the vessels that we found in that structure to explore what people did in the past. Because of course, I can't talk to them directly. So archaeologists study the human past through the medium of the archaeological record, but they do not study the archaeological record. The point of archaeology is not to study the archaeological record. It's to use the archaeological record to study what happened in the past. So archaeology is primarily a methodology. It's a way of doing something, which is why it doesn't really matter if it's in anthropology or ethnologia or history or whatever. It is not an end unto itself. Archaeology is a methodology that explores the human past. It explores humanity through the archaeological record. And in this way, archaeology is kind of like astronomy in a very rough way. Because you see, if that image there on the left, astronomers study cosmic bodies, stars and black holes and planets and asteroids. Astronomers study these things using light, but astronomers don't really study light itself. They just use what they can see. They use the light of the night sky to explore what these cosmic bodies are doing. And this is like archaeology. The archaeological record is like light. We use it to study something that we don't have direct access to. Because astronomers can't actually go to another star or something. At least not yet. So why bother? Why bother, spending 10 years of your life carefully taking apart structure M1415 to figure out its life history or whatever? And basically, this is why we should study, why we should do archaeology, why we should study the human past. Because you see, anatomically modern humans appear basically around 100,000 years ago. Yet writing, like that's one of the first examples of writing there on the left. Writing, the historical record, doesn't really appear until about 6000 BC in the Middle East. Hence, 99.2% of the entire human occupation of the planet went unrecorded by anyone. Because for the most part, the vast majority of the human past can only be explored through the scientific methodology of archaeology. You can't just study written records because there's entire civilizations, there's entire societies, there's entire cultures who didn't have any history to them whatsoever. They have no historical record at all. But all human societies have an archaeological record. Now, archaeology does not exclusively study history, although it may make use of the historical record. Archaeology studies the human past. So why bother studying the human past? Because the human past is really, kind of this undiscovered country. It's kind of this fantastic place that we dream about and that we imagine, but it's not a place that most of us have direct access to or had direct access to. What we have about the past is legends and stories and myths and histories and, tales told around a campfire. Some of these stories are accurate, some of these stories are complete fiction, and most are actually in the middle somewhere. But an archaeology allows us to take these myths and stories and legends and histories and subject them to an objective scientific methodology. So archaeology can often serve as a corrective against mythology, against fictional narratives, and against pseudoscience. And that's something we'll get very important later on. And we're going to be doing this in the context of the human past, these fantastic cultures and societies and civilizations that once existed that are now extinct. Specifically, the archaeology of the human past. In addition, we're going to study why it is important to study the human past. And this is about the distance between fact and fantasy and how to evaluate this distance. And central to this is the idea of critical thinking. You have to be able to think critically about a problem, specifically the human past, to actually do any archaeology at all, to actually know anything about what used to be here on Earth, built and used and modified and abandoned by humans. Because a proficient archaeology creates knowledge. This is why I went into it. I started out as a traditional historian, but I went into archaeology because the idea of rehashing different historical interpretations of something really didn't interest me. I wanted to create knowledge, to learn something new. Because when you create knowledge, the critical thinking of an archaeological perspective allows one to evaluate and reevaluate perceptions about past events. It necessitates a degree of thinking critically about the past. And from a teaching perspective, the hope is that I can communicate these critical thinking skills to you. That you can be able to evaluate arguments in terms of their own logic and assumptions and internal construction. And if you can actually do that on a regular basis, if you develop a sharp and critically trained mind, you have a decisive advantage for the rest of your life. And I'll explain this in terms of a case study about science, legend, history, critical thinking, and archaeology in the case study of the Battle of Little Bighorn. Now, the Battle of Little Bighorn involved the complete last stand and destruction of an American army in the Montana Territory in 1876. And a quick historical lesson very quickly. In the late 19th century, the American frontier was encroaching on the last sovereign Indian nations of the American West. These sovereign Indian nations, particularly the Lakota Sioux Nation, fought back. And this back and forth and treaties and lies and broken lies and broken treaties, largely on the part of the Americans, culminated in an army being sent against the Lakota Sioux in 1876, part of a military campaign known as the Centennial Campaign, led by a Civil War hero called General George Armstrong Custer. And he led his American army into the Montana Territory, chased the Lakota Sioux to the west, and General Custer thought that the Indian nation was retreating from him, but it was not. What it was doing was falling back to the west and gathering allies around it. And in 1876, they whipped this huge Indian army around, this huge mass of Native Americans, and they ambushed George Armstrong Custer at a place called the Little Bighorn River. And there, in a pitched, incredibly ferocious battle, this American army is annihilated. There are no survivors of the Battle of Little Bighorn, including General George Custer himself. And there were no survivors. None of the American soldiers survived the battle. So the result is there were no historical accounts. There was no one to say, this is what I saw, this is what happened. All that really existed were the distant reports of other soldiers who were miles away, the often confused and contradictory account of the Native Americans themselves, who were basically just dodging around in this high grass, trying not to get shot. So in this sort of vacuum of knowledge, the American nation created legends, and it created this legend of the last stand of George Armstrong Custer and his 7th Cavalry. That was the name of the army. And this myth spun this story about brave soldiers, comrades in arms, fighting back to back, surrounded by swirling, howling mobs of Native American soldiers as they died with their boots on. And movies were made about these legends, and we spun all of these fantastic stories. And right up above me, that's a very famous 19th century portrait that was passed around, that was put up in almost every bar in America, telling the story of this great hero, George Armstrong Custer, and he gave his life to settle the American frontier. But because nobody really knew what happened until the archaeologists arrived on the scene. In the late 1990s and in the early 2000s, an archaeological perspective emerged about the Battle of Little Bighorn, in which archaeologists revisited the revisited the historical battlefield, and were able to kind of piece together what actually happened. And if this interests you at all, these are the 3 main books I read. They are fantastic books, detailing the archaeological reconstruction of the Battle of Little Bighorn. It was not a huge, heroic last stand. And they did this through very, very careful archaeology, using metal detectors to track spent casings and bullets left in the landscape. Luckily, the battlefield itself was in pretty good condition. It's not underneath a Walmart or anything. And through careful sifting, through documentation of what they found, through the archaeological record of the battlefield, finding spent shell casings, using metal detectors, they were able to piece together the movement of troops and what soldiers did as the battle commenced in 1876. And one of the really interesting things they were able to do was to sometimes be able to document the movement of individual soldiers across the battlefield as they fired their rifles, ejected a cartridge, like that ejected cartridge right up above me, reloaded their rifle, and continued to fight. And you can literally see in that image on the left, the black rectangles are spent cartridges. The white triangles are bullets that were found. Literally this soldier firing, taking a few steps back, reloading and firing, taking a few steps back, reloading and firing, as these bullets are just landing all around him. Because the Native Americans were just as well equipped as the American soldiers. And once all of this was put together, what emerged was not this massive heroic last stand by a Civil War hero, but rather an extremely confused and confusing series of troop movements across broken hills on the high ground over the Little Bighorn River. And what you can see is confused soldiers trying to rally, being ambushed, moving, being ambushed again, a group of them rallying around their general, Custer himself, who's probably trying to put together his rapidly disintegrating command. And soldiers are scattered all over these foothills. It's not one really huge battle, but appears to be about a dozen small, very intense, scattered fights that ends not with brothers in arms back to back fighting till the last, but as tiny groups of frightened men who drop their rifles and run and are ultimately shot in the back by their Native American enemies. And this is the real history. This is the real sequence of events at the Battle of Little Bighorn, as can be documented by the objective archaeology that was done there. So we can separate what happened, what the archaeology shows through the study of the archaeological record, and what the fantasies and mythologies and histories have dreamed up about the Battle of Little Bighorn. The archaeology at the Little Bighorn battlefield created knowledge and I think, honors those soldiers in a much more accurate and truthful way than the legends starring Olivia de Havilland. And this is how archaeology creates knowledge about the past. It allows one to evaluate and reevaluate perceptions about past events. It necessarily involves critically thinking about the past. What happened in the past? Are you sure? Can that be proved? You should question everything, even the statement, question everything. And if one can recognize good arguments from bad arguments and fantasies from reality, then you can build really good arguments as opposed to really bad ones. And one can actually separate science from something called pseudoscience, something that pretends to be science, but is not. And, our world today is filled with pseudoscience. Now, we're going to do this within the context of forbidden archaeologies. These utterly fantastic and completely unbelievable stories about the human past. Largely because these kind of stories are just a lot of fun to talk about. I mean, who doesn't love talking about biblical giants? But anyway, these also make really good examples of how to use critical thinking to evaluate these claims, to evaluate these narratives, and to show how a scientific archaeology can expose a bad argument and separate a good argument from a bad argument and fantasy from reality. But before we do any of that, we actually have to talk about what science is not, and how science can sometimes become pseudoscience. So science, what is science? And there we have Science Man over there on the left. Science is, and I wrote it down so I don't screw this definition up. Science is the intellectual and practical activity encompassing the systematic study of the physical and natural world through observation and experimentation. Yeah, that sounds about right. That is what science is. Science makes use of the scientific method to test various hypotheses and to build models of greater and greater predictive and explanatory power. And there we have scientists right up above me, building knowledge about the human past. And all scientific endeavors begin with a research question, and all scientific methodology involves testing that research question. What is not science? That is not science. That's just the costume of a mad scientist. Science is not about dressing up in a lab coat. Science is not about wearing a bow tie. Science is not about bleep bloop sound effects. Science is about conducting research. Science is about testing theories. So anyone can use the scientific method as long as you're conducting research, as long as you're evaluating arguments. Science does not start with the conclusion and work backwards. It starts with hypotheses and tests them against the archaeological record. Science is not about appeals to authority. Listen to me because I have a tie on. Listen to me because I'm in a position of authority. Science isn't really even about applying these explanatory or predictive models. It's about coming up with them and testing them. That's what science is. And probably the best and most accessible book about science and about the popular use of science comes from Carl Sagan himself. And there he is right up above me, rocking a burgundy turtleneck like no man has ever rocked a burgundy turtleneck. And he wrote an incredibly influential and incredibly good book about how science can be broken down and used by normal people. And there it is right there, The Demon-Haunted World, Science as a Candle in the Dark. It's a very good book, and I highly recommend it. And a lot of what Sagan wrote about science, I've kind of incorporated inside this lecture. Because you see, there are a tremendous number of stories about the human past. There's mazes underneath the pyramids of Egypt. There's ancient Atlantis. There's aliens from beyond the stars visiting ancient humanity. Some of these stories are believable. Some of these stories are completely bonkers. And most of these guys, like Stargate never attempted to portray itself as accurate. They're just telling a story. Others claim to be the true history of the ancient past. They claim to be nonfiction, and they claim the mantle of scientific inquiry. However, science does have certain rules to it. You have to obey the rules of science if you want to actually do science. And when you're not following those set of rules, that's when you're conducting pseudoscience. You're merely putting on the lab coat. You're merely tying the bow tie. You're adding the bleep bloop sound effects, but you're not a scientist. You're a pseudoscientist. And here are some of those books that claim to be nonfiction. They claim to portray the real history of the human past, the forbidden archaeologies that they don't want you to know. These are pseudoscientific narratives, whether it's Michael Kremno's Forbidden Archaeology or Barry Fell's stories of Roman legionaries crossing the North American continent, or Graham Hancock's stories about ancient aliens traveling through space to build the pyramids. That one always kind of baffled me, like aliens that can cross the unfathomable depths of space are going to come to Earth and pile rocks. Anyway, there are 1,000 versions of these things. From the Vedic creationism of Michael Cremo to the Bronze Age colonies in North America claimed by Barry Fell, to the ersatz Antarctic Atlanteans of Graham Hancock. These are pseudoscientific narratives about the human past that they claim the mantle of science, but they don't follow the rules. But to sort through every single little claim, it would take the entirety of the class. It would take most of next year as well. And you see, the thing about pseudoscience and the thing about these incredible claims about the human past is that for every one you shut down, like 2 more pop to life. Whether it is, the ancient Jewish origin of Native Americans, or the African colonies in the New World, or In Search of Atlantis, which didn't really exist. Pseudoscience is kind of like a Greek hydra, that for every claim that pops up, for every head you cut off, 2 more jump to replace it. You can't really kill it by the application of brute force. I can't kill the pseudoscientific hydra. But what we can do is use the rules of science to teach people that these pseudoscientific claims exist, and we can tell everyone how to kill these hydras, and they will all die. But what we're going to do in the context of this lecture is we're going to look at a few of these pseudoscientific claims about the human past, and we're going to hone our critical thinking skills as we evaluate them. And if you know how to debunk a pseudoscience, if you know how to debunk a fraudulent claim, and how to think critically about an argument, you don't need to address every single claim one at a time. Instead, you can just know what constitutes valid claims of the past. You can just kind of figure out the rules of scientific inquiry, and you can dismiss the hydra completely. It'll just vanish, pop, in a puff of smoke. So we're going to do what Carl Sagan and his awesome burgundy turtleneck want us to do. We're going to kill hydras. And in the context of this lecture, we're going to talk about 3 ways we can make that hydra disappear. 1, the scientific method. 2, Occam's razor. And 3, the idea that extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence. And there's the tools that we're going to use to kill this hydra. One of the main tools you can use against these pseudoscientific hydras, against these really bad arguments that are out there in the world, is the scientific method itself. And you probably remember this from, high school biology. But the scientific method consists of 4 main stages. Stage 1, to formulate a hypothesis. In fact, formulating multiple hypotheses is probably best. Stage 2, to develop a methodology to test or to answer your hypotheses. Stage 3, to then test the methodology through either observation or experimentation. And the results of this observation or experimentation should either support, refute, or modify your list of hypotheses. And then finally, to publish the results in a timely manner. That's the scientific method. It's not terribly complicated. That's what Mr. Science does, and that's what you and I should do, not just in terms of science, but in basic problem-solving situations. So let's apply the scientific method to the Cardiff Giant. In upstate New York in the 19th century, they found the petrified remains of a biblical giant, just like the one that David killed in the Old Testament. And there they are, putting their hands over their heart, removing their hats to honor a creature from the Bible. So that's one hypothesis. This is a petrified giant from the Old Testament. But let's come up with a second hypothesis. What could be another hypothesis? This is a complete fake. It is just a large carved piece of gypsum placed there in an attempt to sell tickets. So those are our two hypotheses. Now we're going to develop a methodology to test these hypotheses. If it is the petrified remains of a living creature, then we should be able to look at it. We should be able to find the remains of petrified bone. We should be able to find petrified hair. We should be able to find the remains of all of these tiny little details that a living creature would have had. We would be able to sort of remove part of the stone and analyze it to see cellular structures that have themselves been petrified. We should be able to see if this thing was once alive. Or we just find the guy who carved it. All right, now let's test our methodologies. If we examine the Cardiff Giant very closely, we do not find tiny little details of hair. We do not find tiny little petrified cells. We do not find the petrified remains of fingernails or these tiny little details that they might have. In fact, there is no evidence that this was a petrified creature at all. On the other hand, we can find the guy who carved it because he said, yeah, I carved it. And in fact, remember that he carved the Cardiff Giant to prove an argument that his good Bible-thumping neighbors will believe anything. And he made quite a bit of money off of them. Here is the Cardiff Giant today. And we can see it and we look at it and we're like, this thing, it just looks incredibly fake. Because it does. I mean, you stare at this thing and you're like, people in the 19th century must be really stupid. They looked at this and they took their hats off and they're like, we're honoring this legend from the Old Testament. But here's the thing you have to kind of ask yourself. Despite how incredibly fake the Cardiff Giant looks, why did people actually believe that this was a petrified creature from the Old Testament? Why were people taken in by what is, let's face it, such an obvious fraud? And the reason is they believed it because they wanted to believe it. They were fooled because they wanted to be fooled. The petrified remains of the Cardiff Giant confirmed what they already thought to be true. They wanted to believe. They wanted to be fooled. They wanted to believe that these biblical giants once walked the earth and that we can find evidence of these biblical giants today. Because people are fooled by exactly the same kind of thing. Whether it's the old Weekly World News publishing information about, the skull of Goliath that was found, or whether it's crazy internet stuff that gets passed around on Twitter or Facebook or whatever social media people are using today. And this is some of the things that you still see today. If you search online, it is not hard to find stories about how archaeologists and scholars have excavated skeletons of biblical giants. And they post these images that you can see there, on the left, that somehow there's this huge conspiracy to hide evidence of that biblical giants once walked the earth. And that, soldiers encountered them in Central Asia. And there's all this that they're trying to hide knowledge that these things once existed. But again, let's come up with multiple hypotheses. So one, we have a global conspiracy to hide scientific evidence of biblical giants being found in the earth. Or two, it's internet hoaxsters swapping cleverly photoshopped pictures. Well, what's the evidence? Well, we actually need to find the bones for our first hypothesis. We need to find these ancient remains. Or these are created by internet pranksters, we should just be able to find the internet pranksters, and they're not hard to find, because largely after a few months they will take credit. And indeed, most of the images you see swapped around on creationist websites are really just the results of Photoshop competitions. Graphic artists who get really bored, designing, a local sign for the local window company. They want to really challenge their skills against each other online. So they will engage in these Photoshop competitions to see who can create the most fantastic, realistic looking image. Whether it is a little kid playing with cards in the Vatican or archaeologists excavating giant skeletons. And these guys will, they want to claim these images. They say, yeah, I created that. That's an evidence of how good I am at Photoshop. And that image you saw earlier, that was from a Photoshop competition. So yeah, there is no evidence that these huge giants have been secretly hidden over time. Now, we're going to move on to our second tool to fight these pseudoscientific hydras. Occam's razor. And Occam's razor is a really powerful tool. It's a really slashing tool to really separate sense from nonsense. Now, Occam's razor is also known as the law of parsimony. And basically, it's really, really simple. Occam's razor simply is the rule that the simplest explanation is the most likely explanation. In short, the more complicated and the more stages an explanation needs, the less likely it is to be correct. And let's take our old story about the giants. What is the simplest explanation? Internet hoaxers, or a vast global conspiracy of governments and the military and scientists to hide evidence of biblical giants? It is obviously the first hypothesis. And now I'm going to ruin Bigfoot for you. Now, cryptozoologists have long proposed that there is a terrestrial primate inhabiting the dense forests of North America. Now, these legends of Bigfoot are found throughout North America, but they're particularly concentrated in the Pacific Northwest, Washington, Oregon, Idaho, Northern California. This primate, Bigfoot himself, is reputedly very shy. The evidence pointing to the existence of Bigfoot basically consists of a series of eyewitness accounts of people who see this crazy thing deep in the woods, or the very famous Bigfoot prints there on the upper left, a handful of blurry recordings like the one right up above me, and some samples of blood and hair and feces that are largely belong to other animals. Now, some of this evidence has clearly been created by hoaxers, and indeed, both of the images right up above my little yellow box are known creations of hoaxers, because the people came out and said, yeah, it was me. I made these like special shoes and walked across some mud to leave these big footprints. Or the people right up above me, that's obviously a guy in a modified gorilla suit. And indeed, those hoaxers came out and said, yeah, that's my buddy wearing a gorilla suit. So there are clearly part of the Bigfoot legend is hoaxers, but there are eyewitness accounts. There are people who give really genuine accounts of seeing mysterious things deep in the woods of Oregon or Washington or Northern California. And they sometimes take images of these blurry, glimpsed animals, huge, 8-9 feet tall, partially covered in hair, looking at them and behaving strangely. Deep in the woods, often tired, often confused hikers have seen and heard mysterious shapes that don't seem to act or resemble any known animal. And these people are clearly not hoaxers. They're clearly not lying. They went into the forest and they saw something back there. So let's approach this with Occam's razor. Let's approach this with a critical mind. What would it take to prove the existence of Bigfoot? It's going to take physical evidence. It's going to take a body. It's going to take part of a body. It's going to take a very clear image. That's what it would take to prove the idea that Bigfoot exists. That deep in the forests of the Pacific Northwest, you have a primate who's 8 to 9 feet tall, very reclusive. It's an animal like no other we've ever heard of. But there is a simpler explanation. In fact, there's a much, much simpler explanation. These people did see something in the deep, deep woods, but it's almost certainly not a hidden secret primate that's been hiding for centuries. There's a much simpler and frankly kind of sadder explanation for what these people glimpse, and in fact, what they took a picture of there in the upper left. And the answer is what Bigfoot really is. Mangy bears. Bears that are dying, bears that have a skin infection, mangy bears. And here we have very sad mangy bears. And bears are terrifying without fur, by the way. They're completely terrifying. But yeah, this happens. You have these bears deep in the woods. They're old. They're sick. They develop mange. Their hair falls out in clumps. They're slowly starving to death because they're sick. And as they do so, they start to behave very erratically. They start standing up. They walk around on their back legs because their front legs are itchy and covered in scabs and they hurt a lot. And the thing is that when people see mangy bears, clearly in the open on a field or next to a road, they take a picture and they go, oh, that's very sad. But that's basically the end of their story. But I want you to take a mangy bear, and instead of putting him on the roadside in the middle of the day, put him 100 yards in a dense forest at twilight or at night. A mangy bear standing up, standing 8 to 10 feet high, behaving erratically. And because they have mange, they don't look like bears. They look like apes. And they behave very erratically, and people see it, and they freak out, and they run away. And they tell people over and over, what did they see? I saw Bigfoot, this strange animal in the forest. But there are not strange animals in the forests. They're not large terrestrial primates. They're just slowly dying mangy bears. That's Bigfoot. Little things seen badly in the forest, legends, a few hoaxsters, and mangy bears. That's Bigfoot. There is no great mystery to Bigfoot, because what is more likely? A mysterious, unknown giant primate living deep in the woods that no one has ever gotten a clear picture of and is known to be associated with pranksters? Or mangy bears? Poor, sick bears without hair, slowly starving to death, acting erratically, standing on their hind legs, being surprising hikers who don't know the woods very well and can't catch a good view of what they're seeing. What is the simplest explanation? What is the cut made by Occam's razor? And the answer is, it's going to cut hypothesis A. Bigfoot is really sad, sick, mangy bears. Now, the third tool that I'm going to give you to sort of kill these pseudoscientific hydras, to debunk these fake arguments, is the idea that extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence. And we're going to do that in the context of the discovery of a new world. And I will see you there.